Jenna, we're the most important people here, right?
Well, of course, Tracy. We're actors. If we didn't exist, how would people know who to vote for?
And people around here shouldn't take attention from us, should they?
No, never. Attention is what gives us power. If someone threatens that, you have to put a stop to it.
If you used any social media platform in the time surrounding the 2020 presidential election, you may have noticed some interesting trends in the editorial behaviors of these platforms regarding the news that Joe Biden clearly cinched the popular vote, and barring massive recounts and audits, and unless some very cold justice is served by at least one Supreme Court justice, will be the 46th President of the United States. Many platforms have begun overtly or softly censoring the opinions of any who could even remotely be considered to be pro-Trump in response to this news. In the cesspool known as Twitter, this took the form of tweets from the sitting president being outright censored and labeled as misleading, and more subtly with links to more information about the voting process being secure and unquestionable, you know, the things that the left screamed for 4 years that it's not. Now we know that mail-in voting really has the best of track records thanks to Twitter fact-checking. For example, earlier in 2020, the New York local race between Suraj Patel and Carolyn Maloney, which took more than 6 weeks to tally due to mail-in ballots, declared a mere 13,000 of those votes as invalid, which, although it did swing the winner, surely doesn't count. Safe and secure, my friends. Similarly, don't worry about the fact that over 500,000 mail-in ballots were tossed out during the 2020 primaries because Twitter is here to set you straight and tell you the truth, or silence you in the process. Facebook has also reported that leading up to the election, they've removed 120,000 pieces of political content from the app and from Instagram, and that they displayed warnings about potential misinformation on 150 million posts. Comparatively, Twitter has flagged far fewer posts as misleading, according to a blog released by the social media giant, stating that they had flagged just 300,000 posts as misleading and only placed warnings on 456 posts, which, considering how often the man tweets, and given his brazen abuse of the caps lock, statistically has been applied probably primarily to Trump's account. Then again, it's also being applied to any tweet, regardless of any other context, that linked to an article about Trump lawyer Sidney Powell, which produced some, not-so-great optics for the social media giant.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
It doesn't just start and end with questions about the election so directly, though, as for weeks the New York Post's article about Hunter Biden, posted on October 14th of 2020, was completely blocked from being posted on Twitter, coinciding with the suspension of the New York Post Twitter account. It was only days before the US election on October 30th that the Post account suspension was lifted and the link could again be shared. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey responded on Twitter saying, quote, "Our communication and our actions were not great." Well, that's one way of saying potentially in violation of the very important free speech protection provided by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Facebook took a less overt route to censoring the Post article, merely deranking any posts or instances of the link being shared, such that it would be difficult to find it on the platform. In response, Senator Ted Cruz subsequently took Dorsey and Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg to task, or perhaps more accurately, took them out behind the chemical shed, on questioning whether these were the actions of a free speech platform, under which Section 230 protects big tech oligarchs and generous Jannies alike from lawsuits filed on behalf of the words or actions of its users, or if they were the actions of a publisher, for which 230 does not provide the same bulwark against civil litigation. In response to Cruz accusing the actions of Twitter in suspending the Post and blocking links to its articles as being the actions of a publisher, Dorsey, who rolled up to this hearing looking like Bandolph the Blue Check, defended these actions by stating that Twitter later unsuspended the Post's account.
It fell afoul of the hacked materials policy. We realized that there was an error in that policy and the enforcement.
Hold on, I'm literally looking at the tweet from Twitter that says your account has been locked. You're telling me that this is not an accurate...
That's a lock.
A response that Senator Cruz also seemed to find not great. Further, when asked the simple question if Twitter would produce the number of times accounts belonging to both Republican and Democrat candidates or elected officials had been in some way censored over the last 4 years, Jack could not answer yes that he would cooperate with the Senate.
Will you commit to this committee that you will answer those questions?
We're going to work to answering broader transparency around outcomes.
All right, that's a no.
When Cruz wasn't putting the screws to Dorsey, Senator Josh Hawley questioned Zuckerberg on the existence of several internal programs at Facebook that he had been tipped off about by a whistleblower, one of which, called Task, allegedly coordinates Facebook's censorship team with their colleagues at Twitter and Google to make decisions about what kind of information is and is not allowed to be posted on the platform. And if there is coordination, that means any platform then. Zuckerberg denied knowledge of some of these internal systems, but when reminded that he was being asked to testify under oath if Facebook worked in collaboration with Twitter and Google on censorship, he admitted in reference to the Task system that the tech giants, quote, coordinate on and share signals on security-related topics and potential harms that we are seeing. Maybe it's just me, but something smells a little off here, and it isn't just Jack's beard. This doesn't all add up to what users can't see, but what they can see as well. As PhD psychologist Robert Epstein, sorry about the name, man, recruited 733 participants of various political ideologies to report on whether or not they had received reminders to vote via Facebook, and found that up until October 29th, only self-described liberals or left-leaning field agents received notices from the social media site about voting. That, at least, is what Epstein has reported, but don't rubber stamp it as a confirmed fact until we see the published data.
That is, we found a period of days when the vote reminder on Google's homepage was being sent only to liberals. Not one of our conservative field agents received a vote reminder during those days.
In total, these actions on the behest of social media companies have seemingly exclusively targeted, or in the case of Facebook, not targeted Trump voters, leaving Biden's social media accounts untouched. The Media Research Center's Tech Watch unit went through all social media posts by Trump, Biden, and their campaigns from May 2018 through October of 2020, and found that Biden had never once been censored, while Trump's posts across Twitter and Facebook had been censored in some form 65 times. Again, I'm not sure how accurate these data are, but as a counterpoint, I certainly also can't corroborate somewhat conflicting information from Media Matters, which in an attempt to discount claims of censorship, interestingly ceased all of its data collection in September of 2020, and found that right-wing pages on Facebook saw far more interaction than did left-leaning pages or politically neutral ones. Admittedly, I don't know what that report was supposed to illustrate, particularly in the light of the discredited Russian Facebook interference narrative, or the fact that Joe Biden dominated the popular vote, but if you're looking for some kind of counter-narrative to the overt speech policing seen in the post-election environment on Twitter and Facebook, well, I'm sure you could concoct one out of the memes alone. YouTube has also begun including links to Wikipedia and other fact-checker websites to any videos discussing the election. Fact-checkers like Snopes.
Absolutely, but not really.
The prevalence of this warning is such that it can be found on a Tim Pool video where he's just reporting about a group protesting for Trump, or this one from Styx Hexenhammer educating viewers about QAnon, which was specifically being critical of QAnon. Getting weirder, the warning was applied to a spiffing Brit video wherein he was playing a fantasy political video game that has nothing to do with the actual election. Whatever your opinion on the election is, it doesn't really matter here, as these warnings or soft censorship, whatever you want to call it, could have an effect on how we perceive media as a fundamental function of our psychology, drawing from many different theoretical frameworks. But data collection is still ongoing, and has further illustrated the importance of censorship on voter outcomes. As for example, the Media Research Center reports that 35% of voters were unaware of the Biden sexual assault allegations, which according to their analysis would have resulted in an 8.9 shift away from Biden based on post-voting survey. Additionally, 45.1% were unaware of the Hunter Biden scandal, which is a bit absurd, but had they been aware of it, they predicted a 9.4% shift away from Biden. These are just a few examples of how censorship has the capacity to majorly affect United States and worldwide elections, and why we do need transparency rather than censorship. And by the way, the censorship seems to be accelerating, as while working on this video, YouTube has suspended OAN, One America News. I can't foresee it getting any better in the times to come. The reason I'm bringing all of this up, though, is because the fields of social psychology and communication have long been concerned with these topics and the effects that such framing has on the perceptions of those messages, the political subject being discussed, and worldviews at large. Specifically, the memes illustrate that people find the idea of embedded thought policing in the digital public square kind of funny, if not ironic. Thus, today, let's look at some relevant theory to help explain what these warnings and censorship mean for civic engagement and the psychology of the voter, drawing from reactance theory, as well as the increasingly important influence of media fact-checkers on public perceptions, with some interesting new research. Just what impact do fact-checking messages have on our interpretation of social media posts? Let's begin by looking at psychological reactance to media messages.
Now, before we get into the research on psychological reactance, it's your boy, Raid Shadow Legends, the unofficial mobile game of Scotland.
That's right, friends, it's Raid time. Raid is a fast-paced, turn-based role-playing game that lets you control a team of unique characters to defeat enemies and monsters in various game modes, including a base campaign, dungeon diving, and PvP. Level up and gear up your team comprised of your favorite champions from the over 500 available heroes and take on any of the constantly changing events and challenges. If you're like me and a lover of the elf ladies, Raid's got you covered. And not only are no two heroes alike, but they're always adding new ones. I really dig the look of so many of these champions and cannot wait to unlock more so I can fulfill my desire of a full roster full of elf waifus.
Go to horny jail.
If you're just starting out, like I am, it's easy to farm XP and gold in the campaign, and you can conveniently speed up the gameplay to quickly power level your new heroes, so you can take them into battle both later in the campaign and in the other game modes. You can also join a clan, mine's Altana Vault, and team up with other players to fight the clan boss. Here you can see me failing terribly. Girl gamers, am I right? You can also challenge other players in the arena for those of you who are more into the PvP. I'm more into the POV. I have to say, I actually was surprised at just how much fun this game is. In this video, we'll learn about how people don't like being told what to do as a product of the effects of psychological reactance. And I think because of that, I had kind of avoided playing it, but I gotta say, this is one of the most fun mobile games that I've played. And I'm saying that as someone who initially wasn't all that interested. This many million downloads don't lie. Also, it's actually challenging, unlike a lot of mobile games, which is why I don't play that many. You can't just cruise control your way to cool through the game. Strategy does matter. So hey, if it sold me, I think it might sell you too. Give it a try for yourself and join my clan so we can play together. This is also a great time to join the game because Raid just had their biggest update ever. The main event here is the Doom Tower. It's a giant tower with 120 floors and a bunch of secret challenge rooms, and 12 cool new bosses to take on. They're also adding 14 brand new champions for you to try out. If you want to get a huge head start in Raid, all you have to do is check the link in the description, and if you're a new player, you'll get your free Void Champion Bulwark, 50 gems, an XP booster, some energy refills, and even an Ancient Shard as soon as you get the game. Hey, I want an Ancient Shard, no fair. Anyway, thank you Raid for sponsoring this video, and with that, let's get into the research by looking at psychological reactance and political reactions. Psychological reactance is the averse emotional response experienced when being told what to do or think, serving as a threat to our freedoms. That is, people like having at least the illusion of free choice, and when we feel that that free choice is being infringed upon, we react negatively by often doing the polar opposite, lashing out as a method of restoring our independence. It's also related to feelings of anger or frustration. Classic experiments from Dr. Stephen Warshall and colleagues have long studied the allure that censorship has toward the information being hidden, and the influence it may have on our beliefs. In one of the later studies, Warshall 1992 invited students to participate in an experiment being conducted at the University of Texas A&M concerning a proposed on-campus policy which would mandate random student drug testing. Participants read a description of the proposal and were then told that they would listen to several tapes, or all of these tapes, from a school meeting describing the specifics of the order. Just before hearing the tapes, the researcher said one of the tapes needed to be removed from the study because the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, the internal council that determines if a study can be conducted ethically, had decided that the tape could not be played until further review. In one condition, the researchers explained that all previous participants had heard the pulled tape, while in the other condition, The researchers explained that no students had been able to hear the tape. All forms of censorship regarding being unable to hear the recording produced a much greater reported desire in respondents to listen to the absent tape. When participants were initially told that they would only listen to some tapes, they were less interested in the missing recording than when they had been told they would listen to all of the tapes. Further, interest was highest when they believed other groups of students had been able to listen to the tape beforehand. Participants also reported being far angrier when they were told that they could not listen to the absent tape, and were the angriest when they were told that others had been able to hear it beforehand and they believed they would be listening to all of them rather than just some of them. When you tell someone they can't listen or have access to certain information, even about something as boring as a recording of the school board, that creates not just rage, but also a strong desire to have access to the information one believes that they are being denied. Slapping a warning label on a tweet or a YouTube video only makes that thing more alluring.
Don't you know adults come up with that stuff just to bug us? See? I step on the grass and nothing happens.
Have you no moral fiber?
Given that this behavior has primarily targeted Trump's Twitter account, videos about the election which do not overtly favor Biden, or tweets which questioned the election and were generally favoring Trump, all being labeled as misleading, that studied the effects of censorship information only on certain people, may provide some answers as to how these actions influence perceptions of the information being censored. In the second experiment, Warshall told some students that they could not hear a specific tape, again about random drug testing on campus, because the IRB had determined that some students who showed a particular pattern of attitudes on a previously administered questionnaire had been labeled as vulnerable, and that he or she, the participant, fell into that vulnerable category. When participants asked about what part of their personality made them vulnerable in particular, the research assistants were instructed to answer that they could not provide specific details. In other words, they were told something about their personality made it so the tape needed to be censored for them. In other conditions, participants were told students at other schools had listened to the tape, but Texas A&M had decided its students could not, that no one was able to listen to the tape due to IRB restrictions, or that no one was able to listen to the tape due to an accident involving the recording equipment. Compared to when there was no reported censorship, students wanted to hear the tape the most when they had been told something about their personality barred them from having access to it, more so than when they were told that no Texas A&M students had heard it, and more so than when they were told no one had heard the tape. The accidental recording error did not affect desires to hear the audio. Participants who thought that no one had heard the tape, that there had been an accident with the tape, or heard nothing about censorship were all about equally favorable towards the idea of random drug testing on campus. In contrast, they were less favorable when they heard that the tape had been withheld from only Texas A&M students, and the most opposed to the proposal when they had been told that the tape was withheld from them specifically due to their personality. When you tell people that some aspect of their self restricts them from having the same access to information available to everyone else, well, of course that creates a strong desire to hear that information, and moreover, it taints the perception that there must be a reason for which the information is being censored, encouraging people who feel only a certain group or individual or idea is being restricted from them to also believe something about that person or that group or that idea is attitudinally agreeable, particularly when those people feel that censorship is not being administered equally. So let's start this conversation on Reactance by giving a big thank you to Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg for creating the greatest possible interest in voting irregularities, rage and anger, and general distrust in the Democrats and the US election that could have been possibly imaginable. Great job, guys. All out of their massive corporation's collaborative sheer ignorance about psychological reactance.
You want answers! I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
If you want to make people think that something never happens ever, the last thing that you should do is prevent people from talking about that thing or having access to information about that thing. Whether or not we experience reactance in regards to political censorship, however, may be dependent on whether or not we agree with the people being censored, as a study from Hayes and Reinecke 2007 illustrated, and may explain why only the right is seemingly perturbed by the fact that Trump's tweets have been censored, why the New York Post was suspended, or that tweets from the general public and officials alike are now being slapped with warnings, as are completely unrelated YouTube videos. To put this study into some historical political context, in 1991, George Bush Sr. placed a blanket ban on the publication of photos of military caskets in the media, presumably so he could go about his saber-rattling and warmongering without the public being exposed to the visceral results of his heinous actions. This ban actually was not lifted until the Obama administration. In 2004, then-incumbent George W. Bush extended the ban. Participants in this study were polled on their preferred presidential candidate before the election that same year. Some were informed about the ban and then asked about their interest in seeing photos of caskets, while others were not reminded about the ban. Bush detractors wanted to see photos of the caskets regardless of whether or not they had been primed with the information about the ban, while Bush supporters were generally far less interested in the images. However, they were the least interested when reminded about the censorship. Specifically, 70% of Bush detractors reported at least some interest in viewing the images, whether or not they had been reminded of the ban. In contrast, 28% of Bush supporters primed about the policy reported at least some interest, compared to 49% of Bush supporters who were not primed. It would make sense why Trump detractors would find no ethical qualm in censoring Trump's tweets, or a New York Post article in the New York Post itself, or placing warning labels on Twitter and YouTube. They just aren't interested in any evidence that might challenge their worldview, and seeing that censorship likely makes them even less interested, perhaps explaining to themselves that the censorship must be justified, as Bush supporters likely did. Thus, reactance is not universal in all instances. If you have a reason to believe that information being hidden might harm your political candidate of preference, then maybe you'd rather not see it and not know the truth, lest that evidence challenge your beliefs and your support. Not all of what's happening on social media is direct censorship, though. Instead, much of it is being framed as correcting misinformation, by telling viewers that the AP has called the race for Biden, or linking them to an article about voting safety. So what are the effects of this kind of political message framing, this indirect, soft censorship? Merrick and Nisbet, 2011, examined the effects of reactance in relationship to political advertisements. While I wouldn't call the misinformation labels on Facebook and Twitter necessarily a political advertisement, given there's some evidence to support that this behavior affects at least Trump directly on his Twitter account more than Biden, I think we should take these data into consideration, given that the warnings being placed on posts arguably denote an aspect of credibility, or in this case, a lack thereof. Merrick and Nisbet looked at reactions to official political messages during the 2008 presidential election between Barack Obama and John McCain, comparing positive campaign ads to negative ones. They found that cognitive responses, that is, thinking about the subject, were less favorable for negative ads than they were for positive ones. In other words, people think more about positive ads than they do negative ads. This was particularly important for low information voters, as they found low and moderate knowledge respondents rated the opponents more favorably when they saw ads that favored a specific candidate, while those highest in knowledge tended to have the opposite of the intended reaction, being less favorable towards a candidate-sponsored ad. Moreover, reactance was higher in responses to negatively valenced advertisements than positively valenced ones, meaning that people are more likely to distrust political information when it is framed in a negative light. This effect, while present across the sample, was most pronounced in those in opposition to a political candidate. That is, when people who supported McCain heard negative information from the Obama campaign, they were less receptive of that information than when they heard positive information from the Obama campaign. Specifically, oppositional groups were very unlikely to accept messages that were sponsored by another party, rather than by Obama or McCain individually. Regardless of political preference, all people who saw the negative ads stated that they would be more likely to vote in that election. The implications of these data are multiplicitous. By applying warnings to the messages of Trump or pro-Trump YouTube videos, or by banning the New York Post, it creates a negative spin on all of the messages themselves, which causes people to be less receptive to that information. This tendency was the most frequent in low information voters and the strongest in political partisans. The priming of information as being contentious places a negative perception upon that information, but may, however, encourage voting behavior overall, which would explain 2020's huge voter turnouts. The role of psychological reactance here is clear, particularly as it concerns information that is negatively valenced. That is, people are particularly likely to feel as if their freedoms are being curtailed when they hear negative information that arises from a political group, rather than from an individual political figure or candidate. And while such an action may inspire greater voting behavior, perhaps explaining the record turnouts we saw for Biden, considerably outweighing support for Obama, even when during a pandemic, other evidence from this study would indicate that attaching negative information to a political message creates a tendency for the viewer to disengage from that message. A doctoral dissertation by Baruzian, 2018, further examined the effects of reactance in relationship to political messages, specifically when those messages were perceived of having been censored. While Dr. Baruzian also examined Turkish and Iranian samples in his work, we're just going to look at the US sample here.
Why would you want to choose anyone else?
Dr. Baruzian found that as reactance increased due to perceptions of censorship, online information seeking also increased, particularly for those with high political self-efficacy, that is, feeling as if they had the capacity to actively influence their political world. Moreover, these tendencies were found to have some effect on partisan information seeking, ultimately producing an inaccurate perception of reality, likely due to seeking out self-conforming data in the face of perceived censorship. When people feel they are being censored, they will seek out information that conforms to their existing worldview, and that information often isn't accurate, particularly for partisans. And speaking of partisanship, information seeking was only present in conservatives in response to reactance. This means that even when liberals feel that their voices are being restricted and that they are being censored, they are less likely than conservatives to seek out additional information. This was particularly so when conservatives felt that they had high levels of political efficacy. The same effect was not observed in self-described liberals, as those who felt particularly efficacious were the least likely to seek out additional information. In short, politically engaged conservatives seek out more information, while politically engaged liberals do not. Interestingly, while reactance was related negatively to the accuracy of one's beliefs, so too was satisfaction with Trump. That means that people who hate Trump are just more likely to also have inaccurate information. The same, however, could soon be true of conservatives if they feel that they are being censored and need seek out more atypical news sources outside of a Trump presidency. I cannot say for sure that that would be the case, but these data are definitive that under the Trump administration, liberals in general did not seek out any additional online information other than what they probably saw in the mainstream news, but conservatives did, and this can lead to disinformation, and therein lies the problem with censorship. When you restrict access to information behind a warning label, it encourages people to seek out additional and often inaccurate sources to bolster their existing worldview. The data here were indicative that when liberals experienced reactance due to perceived censorship, they too did seek out additional information, only when they didn't feel particularly politically efficacious. But the takeaway here is that if you want conservatives to, quote, educate themselves, you cannot stifle their access to information, lest they will experience psychological reactance and by a seeming necessity will seek out alternative news sources that do not align with the mainstream media outlets in terms of what is true. Additionally, reactance in response to perceived censorship may affect different groups of people beyond just the politically oppositional groups disparately, as seen in data from Eng, Kamani, and Lalonde 2019, who examined differences in reactance based on perceived censorship in Iranian, East Asian, and European ancestry Canadians. Participants read a short excerpt promoting social media censorship, either written by a college student or by the Canadian government, representing a low and high threat to freedom respectively. They found that Iranian Canadians experienced psychological reactance to a higher degree when compared to European and East Asian Canadians, but only when the threat to freedom was high and came from an official source. East Asian Canadians were more positive towards censorship compared to Iranian Canadians and European Canadians. Further, they found that cultural experience with censorship was a significant predictor of psychological reactance in the Iranian Canadian sample alone, 41% of whom had spent the majority of their lives living in Iran, compared to only 15% of the East Asian Canadian sample who had been born in or lived in China. These data seem to indicate that people who have experienced censorship firsthand are more likely to experience reactance when they even think about it happening where they live, in comparison to those who may never have experienced government censorship to the same personal degree.
After a hard day's work at the Nvidia factory, there's no better way to relax than by torrenting some anime. And just like that, your social credit score has plummeted 5 points. The People's Party frowns upon your poor taste in anime.
It makes sense then, when liberal and left-leaning media is so rarely, if ever, censored online, why seemingly only conservatives seem perturbed with these types of media messages being plastered all over social media sites, given the very concept may be foreign to non-conservatives in the United States. They cannot understand why anyone would be disconcerted about the labels on Trump's tweets, on YouTube videos, on Facebook posts, because they have no cultural frame of reference. They have no experience with censorship. This also means, though, that it's hard to demoralize people who believe that they have been censored in the past by giving them further evidence of current censorship. If you want to call for healing, be that spelled with an E or with an A, censorship's not the way to do it, as it only exacerbates feelings of psychological reactance, particularly in those who have previously experienced it. In general, just not coming off as adversarial, which I would argue many of these social media messages do, intentionally or not, can play a key role in whether or not people accept information provided by fact-checkers, as a study from Hart et al. 2009 demonstrated in a meta-analysis of 67 studies. The authors suggest that people have two general motivations for seeking out information: defensive and accuracy. Defensive motives are based on closed-mindedness, commitment, and confidence, while accuracy motives are based on outcomes and information utility, both of which collaboratively determine what information we will select to consume. In alignment with dissonance theory, we seek to avoid information that disagrees with our existing worldviews, such as to reduce psychological discomfort. Congeniality bias refers to the selective exposure to information which enables people to defend their existing attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors by avoiding information likely to challenge them and seeking out information likely to support them. Reactance is an extension of this tendency, in that when we do find information that conflicts, we not only usually reject it, but we usually also seek conflicting information. Congeniality bias was positively related to information quality, commitment, value relevance, and closed-mindedness, but negatively related to confidence in or support for one's pre-existing attitude, belief, or behavior. Further, people sought out high-quality congenial information, but not high-quality non-congenial information. To simplify, people seek out information and sources that conform to their existing beliefs and ignore information that contradicts it. Not only that, but they seek out high-quality information that supports them and low-quality information that does not. Thus, these labels and warnings which claim that the election process that we heard for 4 years non-stop was stolen is now suddenly unquestionable will only bolster the beliefs of people who find those messages run counter to their existing mindsets. We can find evidence of this effect outside of the sterile research environment, and within daily news consumption, as a 2004 survey from Pew found that Republicans are about 1.5 times more likely to report watching Fox News regularly than were Democrats. In contrast, Democrats were 1.5 times more likely to report watching CNN regularly than were Republicans. This trend has only grown over time, as a 2019 survey by Pew found that 75% of conservatives reported trusting Fox News, while 77% of liberals said they distrusted the network. Comparatively, only 67% of conservatives said they distrusted CNN, while 70% of liberals said that they trust the news service. People watch news that conforms to their beliefs. Thus, when social media sites insert a specific political idea and insist it is truth, one which runs contrary to the beliefs of the viewer, that viewer is likely to ignore the report and instead often not only deny it, but move their own opinion in a direction counter to the recommendation as a product of psychological reactance. We can find similar results within the realm of persuasion research, specifically under the boomerang effect, wherein persuasive messages produce the opposite of the intended result, in part due to cognitive dissonance and reactance. Classic seminal research on the boomerang effect comes from Garamone 1984, conducted during the 1982 Michigan race. Look, I know this is old, but oftentimes we don't have much better that's also much newer. Participants in this study saw a positive and negative political ad campaign. Only 10% evaluated the negative commercials as very truthful, 54% as somewhat truthful, and 36% as not at all truthful. The influence of the commercials on attitude towards the candidate responsible for the ad was overwhelmingly negative. Only 4% of the respondents reported becoming more positive after seeing the ad, while 40% reported more negative responses. These old data are indicative of the influence of the boomerang effect and of psychological reactance, in that when people are being told what to think and what information is negatively valenced or not, they are unlikely to believe the source of the information as truthful, viewing the target of a negative political ad as less truthful, but also distrusting both the target and the source of the information. Similarly, high involvement voters had less love for either the target or the source of a negative ad than low involvement voters. Moreover, low education voters expressed more positive affect towards the target of a negative ad, particularly when they were also highly involved in politics, while high education voters were very negative towards the target of a negative ad when they were also highly involved. How interesting that the most educated members of society, who are also the most politically activated, are also the most easily influenced by negative political advertisements, while the average American is more immune from these same effects. I bring this old study up because it is further evidence of the resilience of the low information voter on either side of the political divide. Those who are partisans will not change their opinions even when those opinions are devalued, and all that may happen is that high information voters may feel demoralized by the types of information warnings being slapped upon social media. And that right there is probably the point: demoralization. Social media outlets know that these actions will only inflame ire from the Trump campaign and Trump supporters, perhaps though unaware of the long-term effects of psychological reactance, while assuaging the beliefs of Trump's detractors and encouraging political analysts to fall in line with the general media gestalt. Knowing then that the kind of warnings placed on social media may create psychological reactance and affect our political opinions, let's look directly at the effect of labeling someone's speech as fake news. The stated reasons for which social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have placed corrections to what are often just the opinions of its users, but also seemingly just as frequently on facts or data, is that they are trying to combat the spread of fake news. Thus, we need to further understand the influence that warnings have on media messages. In his hearing with Jack Dorsey, Senator Ted Cruz questioned the tech oligarch as to why questions about the validity of the US election were being corrected or outright censored on his platform, including tweets from the Jimmy Carter Baker Commission for Election Reform, to which he responded the purpose was to create a conversation about the topic, not to censor it, even if that is the ultimate effect, and it's kind of difficult to create a conversation when you're silencing someone's speech. He also stated that he didn't know if Twitter clearly labeling itself as a publisher via these actions would subsequently censor or fact-check Senator Cruz's tweets.
If I tweeted that statement with a link to the indictment, would you put a warning on it that says, well, the Democratic Party position right now is voter fraud doesn't exist?
I don't think it's useful to get into hypotheticals, but I don't believe so.
You don't believe so? Well, we're going to test that because I'm going to tweet that and we'll see what you put on it.
As of this recording, none of Cruz's tweets have been censored. But hilariously, the Yahoo Finance recording of this hearing, which was posted to YouTube, wherein Cruz asked these questions, has been flagged with a boilerplate tag that the Associated Press has called the race for Biden.
What a coincidence!
I feel like I could kind of just end the video here, but no. We always need more science and more data, and the science seems to indicate, as we should know based on research on psychological reactance, that labeling something as misinformation doesn't always have the intended effect. Luckily, we don't have to guess too much about the influence of disputed facts labeling because it was already studied by social scientists in the context of the 2016 presidential election by Pennycook, Cannon, and Rand 2018. In their preliminary study, participants were exposed to obvious falsities, such as, quote, "the Earth is a perfect square," well, obvious to everyone except maybe that time cube guy, and obvious truths, such as, "there are more than 50 stars in the universe." They also saw less commonly known pieces of information, some of which were true, while others were false, including a statement that Angel Falls is a real place in Brazil. They then answered some demographic questions and were subsequently asked about the accuracy of some of the information that they had previously been exposed to in the first step, as well as some novel questions. Participants were more convinced that a claim was either true or false after they saw it for a second time, only when that information was not common knowledge. This initial test indicated that people may come to find things more true or be more convinced of their own beliefs the more times they are asked to think about a topic. That's where the second study comes in, and oh my goodness, am I excited to talk about study 2. If for no reason other than because it makes me laugh, but also because it's currently extremely relevant. In the second study, Pennycook et al. Provided participants with 6 images of real news headlines and 6 images of fake news headlines, sourcing Snopes for the titles of these articles. Some of my favorites include, quote, Mike Pence, gay conversion therapy saved my marriage. BLM thug protests President Trump with selfie, accidentally shoots himself in the face, and election night, Hillary was drunk, got physical with Mook and Podesta. Half of the headlines included a warning that fact-checkers disputed the claims made in the article. Participants were asked if they thought they might share any of these stories on social media. As with the preliminary study, after seeing these 12 reports, participants then answered some socio-demographic questions, including their preference for Trump or Clinton in the 2016 election. After answering the questions, they saw the same 12 headlines again, along with 12 new headlines, 6 of them real, 6 of them fake, and with half of participants seeing a fact-check warning on the fake news stories and then asked to rate how accurate the headlines were and whether or not they remembered having had seen the headline in the past. Subjects rated the headlines that they saw twice as more familiar, predictably. They also reported being less willing to share stories on social media that were labeled as disputed, but repetition also had an effect on perceived accuracy, such that nearly twice as many participants viewed fake news headlines as accurate when they saw them twice. It should be noted, though, that this effect was pretty small compared to the total affected sample size. Specifically, while only 4% of those exposed to fake news headlines viewed them as accurate at first glance, when exposed to the headline a second time, this amount increased to 7.6% of participants who believed that the fake news was accurate. While this means less than 10% of the population is actually likely to believe in fake news, be it left or right-leaning in its partisanship, repetition of fake news may increase the percentage of people who believe it as true. Both Democrats and Republicans viewed real news as far more accurate than fake news, but were also less likely to believe that real headlines were accurate when that headline was discordant with their political orientation. They were slightly less likely to believe fake news that supported their preferred presidential candidate, but to a small degree compared to the differences in accuracy between fake and real news headlines. Moreover, a warning on real news headlines had almost no effect on the perceived accuracy of the report, but particularly when the message was discordant towards the political beliefs of the reader. That is, people are very slightly more likely to disbelieve news labeled as fake, specifically when that news favors their preferred political candidate. This means that both Republicans and Democrats are more distrustful of fake news that supports their political beliefs rather than challenges them. That kind of flies in the face of everything we hear about partisan news consumption, doesn't it? A third study replicated the second, but this time waited a week after the first exposure to the headlines and the second exposure to the original headlines, as well as the novel ones. Once again, placing warnings on real news stories had no effect on the perception of the story's accuracy even over time. In total, without warnings, repetition of fake news stories slightly increased perceptions of their accuracy over time, resulting in a 64% increase in the number of participants judging fake news headlines as accurate among stories seen twice compared to novel fake news headlines. This was true for fake news headlines that were both concordant and discordant with one's political beliefs. People were no more likely to believe a fake news story that aligned with their politics even when they saw it multiple times than they were a fake news story which was oppositional to their politics. It's important to note again, though, that not only are people not more likely to believe fake news that agrees or disagrees with their politics, but that the total effect size here was again negligible, ranging from 4.7% of participants who believed fake news stories during the initial exposure to just 7.7% after repeatedly having seen fake news headlines over time. Thus, not only is the influence of fake news a non-partisan issue, affecting people of all political leanings, whether that news concurs with their political orientation or not, the extent of this influence applies to less than 10% of people. People don't believe fake news. And while a warning sign may stymie increased perceptions of accuracy of a fake news story that one has been exposed to multiple times, warning labels have absolutely no effect on the perceived accuracy of real news. Thus, knowing what we know about psychological reactance in research, and judging by the countless memes already mocking the authoritarian absurdity of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube warnings, which slapped an inaccurate reporting label on a spiffing Brit video about a political video game, I can only imagine these warnings will have no effect on the opinions of viewers, but may, in fact, produce an antithetical reactance-like response, with people being more trusting of sources that are both accurate in their reporting and have that label applied to them, as backwards as that may sound. When you slap a label on a Tim Pool video, that's not going to convince anyone that Tim is wrong. To the contrary, it's kind of the equivalent of saying he's correct. Another study from Pennycook and Rand 2019 found that it's not political partisanship nor stupidity, but rather probably laziness that resulted in the increase in the belief in the accuracy of fake news. Using the same hilarious supplementary materials as the previous study, the researchers sought to extend their findings to answer the why questions regarding fake news.
But why?
That is, on the rare occasions that people do believe fake news stories, given it doesn't seem to be limited to one partisan group or the other, why do they believe that fake news? As in the previous study, participants were asked if they had seen the headlines before, how accurate they believed the headlines to be, and how likely they might be to share that story on social media. The degree to which participants stopped to think and question their gut responses towards a topic was measured with the cognitive reflection task, or, yeah, acronymically, CRT. Just can't escape from those cathode ray tubes on this channel. Anyway, participants also completed, and no joke, this is the exact name that the researchers gave to it, a pseudo-profound bullshit receptivity task, wherein they were exposed to phrases containing large, complex vocabulary, but sometimes with no substantive meaning. For example, quote, "We are in the midst of a high-frequency blossoming of interconnectedness that will give us access to the quantum soup itself."
Forget about the techno talk. No one's really interested in it.
In other words, bullshit. Participants were asked to rate how profound they thought these statements were. Finally, subjects self-identified with a political party and answered who they had voted for in 2016. Once again, the results here are telling. All fake news, regardless of its political leanings or even apolitical fake news, were viewed as inaccurate by both Trump and Clinton supporters. There were differences here, though, in that Clinton supporters were even less likely to believe all forms of fake news and were also less likely to share fake news on social media. But interestingly, Clinton supporters were the least likely to share fake news that favored Democrats. Again, to be clear, no one believes that fake news is accurate, at least in aggregate. Not Trump supporters nor Clinton supporters. But Clinton voters did seem to be even less likely to believe fake news than were Trump fans. When taking cognitive reflection into consideration, the small number of participants in this study who initially believed that fake news might be accurate were reduced in their perceptions of accuracy when they deliberated upon the content cognitively. Interestingly, Republicans were more likely to believe fake news that favored Clinton even after deliberation than Democrats were to believe fake news that favored Trump. But hang on, this goes both ways. All people assessed were far more likely to view real news as accurate, but particularly so when they deliberated upon the accuracy of that news, with one exception. Republicans actually tended to view pro-Clinton real news as negligibly less accurate after thinking about it critically. In general, thinking about a news story across the board increased accuracy. Subjects were more likely to believe real news when it was concordant to their political stances, but were about equally unlikely to believe fake news regardless of its political orientation. Moreover, it doesn't seem that Trump supporters are any more likely to believe fake news, specifically when it favors Trump, but instead that they are marginally less able to discern which news is accurate regardless of its origin, be it favorable to Democrats, Republicans, or neutral. While the findings of this first study seem to indicate that Democrats or Clinton supporters just seem better at determining if fake news is fake, the authors suspect that their stimuli might have favored Democrats. Thus, in their second study, they included almost all of the both anti-Trump and anti-Clinton headlines that I found most hilariously absurd. Similar results were present, with very few people finding fake news to be accurate, particularly after thinking about it. And once again, that Democrats and Republicans' belief in the accuracy of real news that favored or disfavored their candidate were nearly identical to one another. That is, Democrats thought real news that favored Clinton was more accurate, while Republicans thought that real news that favored Trump was more accurate, and vice versa. This time, Democrats were more able to discern the accuracy of news that favored Democrats, while Republicans were more able to discern the accuracy of news that favored Republicans. It's almost like people know their own party's stances better than they do the stances of their oppositional party. The main takeaway from these two studies, though, is that more analytic people were less likely to believe politically consistent fake news than less analytic people, regardless of their political alignment, once again illustrating the problem of the low information voter. Fake news is not something that influences a large portion of the population, though, and there is no evidence that it influences Republicans or Trump supporters any more than it does Democrats, particularly when analytical skill is taken into consideration. Hence, there's no empirical rationale to place warnings and fact-checking links only on posts and videos that may in some imaginable way be right-leaning. Although considering the Homer Simpson makeup shotgun approach to anything that could be seen as potentially pro-Trump, like a completely unrelated spiffing Brit video, or a recording from a congressional hearing without commentary, I would argue that not only do these things not work, they're likely to induce psychological reactance. There may be some positive use of political retractions and warning labels, even if they don't always work as intended, as seen in Ecker et al. 2014, who wanted to test if pre-existing attitudes remained stable in the face of claims of misinformation. In their first experiment, participants read an article that claimed a liquor store was robbed by suspects believed to be Australian Aboriginals. Why do I always feel like I'm not supposed to say those words?
I'm sorry, what do you call yourself?
A Puerto Rican.
No, I know you can say that, but what do I call you?
A Puerto Rican.
Wow, that does not sound right.
This information was later retracted in one version of the report, but not in the other. The third version described the suspects as Caucasian and also contained no retraction. Participants' levels of racial prejudice against Aboriginal people were measured in response to the article, and they were asked to recall as much about the article as they could. People who scored relatively high on racial prejudice mentioned the race of the suspects more often than did people low in racial prejudice when recalling the article, but mainly when this information was explicitly supplied without being subsequently retracted. The authors were specifically looking for references to critical information given in the article, whether it had been labeled as retracted or not. For example, in response to a question about why there is a miscommunication during the robbery, a participant might use this critical information to state that the reason for the miscommunication was because Aboriginal people apparently didn't understand the store owner, even though such a connection was never made in the article itself. It's basically making an inference based on racial prejudice. When the store was said to have been robbed by Caucasians, few references to misinformation and rationales as to why the store was robbed were provided by participants, regardless of their levels of racial prejudice. When there was no retraction, those with more racial prejudice recalled the most information about the Aboriginal criminals, but those with low racial prejudice recalled more information as well, compared to when there was a retraction. Misinformation was recalled to about equal degrees when a retraction was included. A second study found similar results, this time eliminating the control condition and showing participants a PowerPoint presentation where they first read that an Aboriginal person had stepped in during a robbery to defend the store owner, but in the retraction condition that the police later released a statement saying that the hero was a non-Aboriginal person. People who rated lowest on racial prejudice were the most likely to remember information about the race of the person when they were listed as a hero, both when the information was listed as accurate and when it had been subsequently retracted. It's telling that people who are supposedly not racist are the most likely to remember the race of someone when they were framed as the hero. This is likely a function of cognitive dissonance, in that initial opinions shape our subsequent beliefs, and to deny those initial beliefs, even in the face of a retraction, can cause psychological discomfort. The propensity to accept information received first as accurate is also sometimes called the primacy effect. The takeaway here of interest, though, is that while negative opinions towards someone are diminished by retractions, regardless of your political stance, positive opinions remain high even after retraction among less prejudiced persons. In the context of the 2020 election, when the media has constantly portrayed Trump as a villain, there's a New York Times article from 2019 where they claim that he wanted to put electric fences and pits full of snakes around the US border. You know, something that Dr. Evil would do.
I have one simple request, and that is to have sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
Yeah, in response, people are probably going to be more likely to see him as the bad guy regardless of their political stances and regardless of a retraction. Even after hearing a story about him kicking a box of kittens into a river, if it's retracted as him having saved a box of kittens, the initial impression remains. In contrast, people who heard positive initial information about Trump and were also less partisan may remain more positive towards him even after hearing that he didn't save a box full of kittens. Media framing, primacy, and recency can have all of these effects in tandem with misinformation labeling. While I call this the primacy effect based on, the pervasiveness of that theory for more than a century, Ecker and colleagues refer to this as the continued influence effect of misinformation. As a great Death Cab song once opined, maybe they're just different names for the same thing.
This is what you all get for trusting your mail to the same group that cost us an extra Death Cab for Cutie record in 2002, right between the photo album and transatlanticism, when they were at the very peak of their brilliance.
In an additional study from Ecker, Hogan, and Lewandowski 2017, they proposed that by even mentioning the misinformation which is being debunked, it reinforces previously held beliefs, which would be an excellent argument for censorship of tweets. In this experiment, participants first read a news article about a wildfire, which was either said to have been a natural disaster or deliberately lit, and then a follow-up article, of which there were 4 different versions. One with no retraction, one with new information but a reminder of the previous news report, one with a subtle reminder of the inaccuracy of the previous report, and finally one with an explicit reminder of the retraction of the previous publication. They found that each level produced subsequently decreased recall of the initial report that the fire had been due to arson. This means that people do believe retractions, and specifically recall more from explicit misinformation claims. However, a significant number of people continued to recall information from the first source, rather than from the corrected source. This not only has implications for news outlets that publish fake news and then quietly release retractions, but also the influence of misinformation claims placed on social media sites. It seems that based on the influence of the primacy effect, it is difficult to correct information once it has been disseminated, which surely is the rationale in censoring supposed fake news on social media. Although again, when you censor something, as we know, that likely creates reactance. Regardless, there is some evidence that misinformation persists after correction, as Thorson 2016 found in what she described as belief echoes. In her first study, participants read a correction about a story that had previously erred by misspelling the name of a donor to either a Republican or a Democrat political campaign, and reporting that the donor was actually a drug dealer, when he was, in reality, a car dealer. Then again, the difference is arguable.
Would you like to take this baby home today, sir?
Well, I don't know. I don't think so.
Why?
Well, I have to check with my wife first.
Why? I don't have to check with my wife before I sell it.
Subjects who identified as Republican read that the politician was a Democrat, and for self-identified Democrats, that the politician was a Republican. Participants were asked about their opinions towards the local political candidate, with some reading nothing about this scandal, the control, some reading only the news that the drug dealer had donated to his campaign, and some reading the retraction. Negative opinions, well below the control, were reported even when the message was retracted. That is, retractions or fake news warnings might not do that much to sway opinions when the news is believable, particularly when they concern a political opponent. Even if Trump ends up being right about everything, or if Biden does, the other side will likely never believe either claims, after being influenced by cries of misinformation or voter misbehavior in one form or another for 4 years from both sides. A second study found that misinformation decreased approval for a candidate even when that candidate is a member of one's own political party. While participants were generally more supportive of their same party candidate, even when they heard that candidate may have taken money from a felon, than they were of an oppositional party candidate, in each instance, positive appraisals were restrained compared to the control for any candidate when a negative news article about that candidate was not only released, but when it had been corrected as well. This means that first impressions matter, and they matter both in that a negative claim about a candidate will persist, but also that even if there found to be questionable actions regarding the 2020 election, retractions will never be able to reinstate the initial opinions of voters. In a third experiment, deliberation was again assessed, this time in the form of a memory test administered after initially reading about the misinformation and its correction. When participants were encouraged to think more critically, the negative influence of the misinformation was negligible for their own candidate that they supported, but persistent for the oppositional candidate. Another important thing to consider here is the effect of reactance, in that after an article was retracted, both party supporters and antagonists had increased support towards the target of the negative information. Additionally, both sides had decreased opinions of the publisher of this information, but particularly, supporters of the accused politician really did not like the publishing outlet. The important thing to note here, though, is that while it's a small amount, 3.3% of those who opposed the political candidate who had had the hit piece written about them continued to believe that information even after it had been retracted. In other words, people remember lies they hear about their political adversaries. Even when those lies have been debunked, they will continue to believe them. This means the entire idea of putting warning labels on things is probably futile at best and potentially harmful for political discourse at worst, particularly when it is being slapped onto any and all coverage of a presidential election that may lean to one side, or on completely irrelevant videos about video games. When we take the commonality of cognitive miserliness into consideration, how many people will actually fact-check the fact-checkers? Probably very few, I would imagine. As much as I would love to individually cover the many studies that have examined the power of misinformation claims, let's look at the big picture here. Specifically, other data indicate that debunking does very little to change pre-existing opinions. Again, perhaps encouraging and egging on psychological reactance, as Chan et al. 2017 investigated in a meta-analysis of 20 experiments on the influence of debunking attempts. Misinformation had the largest effect size across these studies, with debunking attempts being mostly minimal in their ability to change existing opinions. Moreover, there was a persistent tendency for people to continually recall misinformation even after that information was debunked. Across these studies, elaboration was again important. Specifically, when people came up with excuses to justify the legitimacy of the misinformation that they had heard or were initially exposed to, the less impactful those correcting messages were over time in perceptions of accuracy. What this means is that putting a warning label on a piece of information is less likely to convince a person exposed to that message that it was incorrect, but instead that rumination and deliberation about the media message is more influential to discerning whether or not the news was accurate. Let me really hit that home. Thinking for yourself, across a meta-analysis, even coming up with explanations for the validity of the fake news, is more likely to produce disbelief in that fake news than are explicit media warnings. Once again, telling people what to do or what to think doesn't seem to work as well as freedom of thought. With everything we've seen about the influences of psychological reactance and misinformation warnings on political opinions or outcomes, let's come to some conclusions about how social media messages may influence not just one's personal opinions, but the cultural gestalt as it concerns politics and psychology. And be aware, friends, this censorship is far more likely to get worse than it is to get better. While working on this video, 4 Democrat senators, Gary Peters of Michigan, Robert Mendez of New Jersey, Mazie Hirono of Hawaii, and Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, all sent a letter to YouTube CEO Susan Wojcicki, expressing a deep concern regarding supposed misinformation being shared on the site pertaining to the election. Of course, this isn't government manipulation and strong-arming in any way. Clearly, the warning labels weren't enough, and I'm sure YouTube will bend the knee to appease their overlords in the US government, particularly if they want to keep that sweet Section 230 protection, which not only Trump is threatening, but which Biden has also said he wants to repeal. I suppose the tech oligarchs looking down the barrel of a potential end to 230 protection either way, well, perhaps they thought Biden was the safer choice. I doubt it. Just as I doubt any mainstream modern politician besides Ron Paul has ever looked at a freedom that he or she didn't want to restrict. But we'll see. Before I close out here, it's also important to understand the potential effects of fake news both within the direct political realm and without. And I can think of no better recent example than the case of YouTuber Arch, who has received now several media hit pieces calling him every type of ist and phobe imaginable. Not because he is one, but because they wanted hate clicks, and perhaps because they were jealous that he got early access to review a porn game, Subverse, a game that surely under any other circumstances outlets like Kotaku would mention only to bash it as misogynistic. It's clear this is a coordinated attack, as within 12 hours of the first hit piece in PC Gamer being published, which outright calls Arch a racist in the headline, more started popping up accusing him of alleged racism, all linking back to the PC Gamer article for proof, which is circular logic, and which itself links to out-of-context jokes in videos and Discord messages. One of these damning pieces of evidence is just a reference to a Chris Rock joke. Others are mocking the racism inherent to Warhammer lore itself. But who cares about context or reality when you can get clicks? This behavior flies in the face of journalism ethics courses, I know from having had taken them, and I know are a requirement for any PR or journalism degree, which emphasize a duty to things like truthfulness and beneficence, that is, doing no harm, illustrating the true abysmal state of a once respected field, and further proof of the futility, though, of media manipulation. Because not only has there been community support for Arch, but the devs themselves, while making a hasty initial apology, were then adamant in their response about their support for him and that politics has no place in sexy space. Once again, media telling people what to think doesn't always work, and often instead produces a reactance effect in the opposite direction of the intended persuasive message. With everything we've seen about the influences of psychological reactance and misinformation warnings on political opinions or outcomes, let's come to some conclusions about how social media messages may influence not just one's personal opinions, but the cultural gestalt as it concerns politics and psychology. We have seen that telling people that they are wrong often encourages and exacerbates their pre-existing beliefs as a function of psychological reactance. First of all, no one seems to find fake news to be credible, regardless of their political ideology. Further, labeling things as fake news when it is real news seems to have little effect at best and reactionary effects at worst. Thus, we need to always be active and critical media consumers. We cannot allow labels and warnings to determine our beliefs, but luckily, nor are they likely to, regardless of our political orientations. The behavior across social media platforms, even if well-intentioned, and I kind of doubt that, would never have probably encouraged additional information seeking, only further polarization, distrust, and psychological reactance. I would argue that fewer people would have been interested in investigating the 2020 presidential election were it not for the seeming media coordination between different social media sites to censor Trump's tweets, label Facebook posts as misinformation, and place a warning on random YouTube videos. Sometimes perhaps the highest form of action is inaction, for action implies motive, even if there isn't one. By the way, I just paraphrased the former Democrat governor of California, Jerry Brown, right there. But hey, what do you guys think? Have you ever felt compelled to believe the opposite of what someone tells you is real, out of a conscious or perhaps subconscious degree of psychological reactance? Further, how do media misinformation labels make you feel? And do they cause you to believe or disbelieve the claims made within? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I also want to give an enormous shout out to all of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for supporting me while I work on long projects like this that require me to constantly make updates because things keep happening. You guys are the best. If you want to support the channel, there are ways to support down in the description, including Patreon, Subscribestar, and a link to my merch store. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.